people think it's going to be this really quick tool for sales. You're going to be on one podcast and there's all the right people are going to hear that one podcast and just come running to you and want to buy your services.
I don't think there are many things that are less true than that. Dear listeners, we are gathered here today to reflect on a podcast that is no longer with us. Give it a rest. It was a podcast that explored the importance of giving ourselves a rest and permission to quit things that don't feel aligned. Haunting us today is its host, Kacey Hayes. Launched in April 2022, 10 episodes were published in total before the show was left to perish 15 months later. On this episode, we'll learn what caused Give It a Rest to be yet another headstone in the podcast graveyard. We'll celebrate the highs, lament the lows, and discuss whether it should be laid to rest forever or be brought back to life. From One Fine Play, this is Podcast Graveyard. Hi Kacey, thanks for haunting the show today.
Hi James, thanks for having me.
Could you just give us a quick 60-second explainer about what the podcast was about?
Yeah, so it was a solo podcast. It was a passion project of mine. So I think that was a big part of what eventually led to its demise. But I started it wanting to create a place where things like hustle culture, diet culture, productivity culture, all the things that we are essentially conditioned to accept and don't really question very much. Question why we go along with those things if we don't necessarily agree them, if our values are different, and consider why it might be important to quit those things and like how quitting can have a very valuable place in your like personal development, in your growth, all of those things, how it can actually be beneficial to you as a person to quit instead of, oh, you're such a quitter. It's always used very in a derogatory way. And I wanted to explore maybe some opposite aspects of that.
So tell me, why did you want to make the podcast?
I wanted to make this podcast because I saw a gap that I felt needed to be filled. I felt like a lot of people weren't talking about the reasons for quitting. A lot of things that we see, especially in the entrepreneurship space, which I'm in, are reasons not to quit, reasons to keep going, reasons to be consistent, productive, all the things like that. And I was like, well, maybe there's also a case for quitting things. Maybe if we don't quit things, we're pushing like a boulder up a hill, we're going in the wrong direction, we're pursuing options that maybe aren't aligned for us. And let's maybe question why quitting has such a bad reputation and question why we're doing the things we feel like we might want to quit.
When you started out, what were your expectations? What were you hoping to achieve?
I think I wanted people to feel seen. I wanted to create community. I wanted people to question their beliefs around quitting, the things they could just say, give it a rest to.
So you were hoping to build a community around this idea, is that right?
I think so. And because it wasn't technically a business podcast, like, a lot of people have, they use it as a business tool. It was more of like a personal passion project. I think I didn't really think about, okay, the things I would think about now if I was going to launch a podcast. How often are we going to publish episodes? How are we going to keep generating content? Do you want to have guests on? What would you talk about? How will that serve the overall mission of the show? Where do you see it in a year or maybe even 2 years from now? All these questions that I would ask myself now, I did not really consider at the time. And I was just like, I'm just going to go with it. It felt very like intuitive, but also very, I don't know, kind of like willy-nilly in a way. I was like, I'll just see what happens.
How long were your episodes and how did you plan them? Because I think for solo episodes, that's a completely different skill to the one that is normally talked about, because most people assume a podcast with a guest where you have questions and you do research and all that kind of stuff. But with a solo episode, obviously, that's not normally there. So I'd love to just understand very quickly a little bit about what you were doing for that process and how long your end episodes were and how did you manage that whole recording and editing thing.
Yeah, that's a really good reason why I stopped doing it too. The word that keeps coming to mind is very unsustainable. It was very, I would just randomly come up with ideas, like a topic that would keep coming up in conversation with people, which doesn't necessarily make it a bad idea. It's just that it wasn't very, I didn't have a lot of prep for it. I think I tested doing some scripted and some unscripted. Yeah, it was kind of a mess.
Unscripted means you just sat down and kind of like recorded a one-man therapy session and then shared it with the world.
Almost.
Amazing.
Yeah, it was, I would have a few bullet points and just go from there because I didn't want to stifle myself too much.
So they were all different lengths?
Yeah, I think they usually ran between 15 and 30 minutes. Some of them were under 10. I am not a podcast editor, and I spent a lot of time editing after the fact. A lot of silent pauses, a lot of ums, a lot of oh, I lost my train of thought. Let me cut that out.
So you did do some editing?
Yeah, it was not great. But yes, I wanted it to be clean before I would publish it. So if there were instances where I lost my train of thought again, or like long pauses again because I didn't plan where I was going to go with that particular line of reasoning, I would try to trim those down.
So you were also editing, and you just said that you're not an editor. So I guess you were learning the editing software. And then not only that, you're editing your own train of thought. So there's no objective third party looking at it, deciding if it's interesting or not, because it's also just what you were thinking.
Yes. It showed me the value so deeply of people that manage the back end of podcasts. Like, it is such an invaluable skill that people have, and I do not possess it.
Let's dive in the deep end. How much time do you think you put into making the podcast?
Gosh, that's a great question. From coming up with the concept to the artwork and show descriptions and all the little nitty gritty pieces, I mean, it had to be dozens of hours. Like, and then also, recording and editing because I'm a slow editor because I don't have that skill. I never thought about how much time I must have spent on it. Like probably between 50 and 100 on 10 episodes, from coming up with it to all the way to the end.
So let's say a day an episode. It's a big commitment.
It is.
How much money do you think you put into it?
I guess I would have to think about that in terms of, I guess, how much my hourly quote unquote wage is now that I pay myself in my business, because I did everything myself. So I did the show descriptions and the show notes and the art for the podcast and the editing and all the things that you'd normally outsource to a paid skilled person.
Did you spend any physical money? Like, did you use free editing software and free hosting, or were you paying for those things?
That was all free. It was called Anchor at the time. Now it's Spotify for podcasters, and they have built-in, very basic, like, editing software where you can just cut things out. That's all I needed. Like, it was just a passion project. So I would cut out the long pauses or the ums or whatever, and the platform itself is free. So hosting it was no charge. So I really didn't have, aside from my own time and energy put in, there was no like actual money that I had invested into it.
What was the biggest obstacle you faced when trying to make the show?
Consistency killed me because I did not plan. I did not consider different energetic needs on different days. Like I do now with my current podcast, we record ahead so that when life happens, we're not scrambling on the back end like, oh my gosh, we have a podcast due and we have nothing in the can. What are we going to do? So much unnecessary stress. That was never a thought that I had when I was running Give It a Rest by myself. I think in talking about it with you, I'm kind of realizing I didn't really take it very seriously. It's interesting because at the time when I was coming up with it, it felt very important and something that I felt like I needed to do. But without any of the foundational work in place of how am I going to maintain consistency? How am I going to come up with ideas when I don't feel like coming up with ideas, or I feel like I'm scraping the bottom of the barrel? How often do I want to interview people? Do I want to stay solo? I can see last year the version of myself just being like, I don't know. We'll figure it out. I don't know.
Such an interesting reflection that at the time you were putting in a whole day an episode. That's a big commitment for something that you now sort of realize you weren't that committed to. That's why give it a rest, finally got given a rest. Consistency is so important as well. Whatever your consistency is, whether it's daily, weekly, fortnightly, monthly, it doesn't matter. That consistency is so crucial. I guess there are other things that go around making a podcast that you learn on the way, like marketing, for example, which is a whole separate problem that on reflection you also realize was another obstacle, but probably directly related to the fact that you weren't as committed as you thought you were.
Yes. I think I deeply underestimated the level of commitment needed for a sustainable, consistent podcast.
I think that's something that catches so many people out, is that whether you're doing it as a passion project or professionally, there is like a minimum commitment that you need to make it work.
Yes.
If you don't pedal the bike fast enough, you fall off.
Exactly. I think it's easy on the surface to look, especially now with how much podcasts have taken off in the last few years, especially. It's easy to think, well, so-and-so is doing it, they're doing it. There's such a low barrier to entry for podcasting in general, because you can take advantage of free tools and free hosting and all that stuff if you want to.
It's a perceived low barrier to entry rather than actual low barrier.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
I often talk about it as a second-rate citizen is how people look on it. Oh, this is going to be a bit easy and cheap and fast. And actually, it's not those things. And in recent months, we've seen the rise of video podcasting. And that's a real interesting challenge for the people that do think of it as a easy, quick format, because now they're like, well, I want a video, but the video is going to make it a bit more difficult, isn't it? Because now I've got to think about all these other things, but I want it, but I don't want it, but I want it, and they get caught. And it's all around this same challenge of, well, it's not actually as easy as it looks.
100%. Yeah.
Have you got any really embarrassing or cringeworthy stories you can share from those first 10 episodes?
I guess, again, just that perceived ease that you talked about. I did think it was going to be easier than it was, because it was just going to be me sharing my thoughts, conversations that I knew people wanted to have but weren't having in that particular space. It's funny to think back, and it wasn't even that long ago, just like how much I've learned since then, that like it's a real commitment, it's real work, all these things. It's not some, fly by the seat of my pants kind of, figure it out, because I didn't figure it out. It died.
I guess also because you thought it was interesting in your head when you were having the thoughts and you spoke to some of your friends in private and they were kind of entertaining conversations, then, your brain goes, oh, well, everyone's going to love it if I love it. Everyone's going to find it fascinating.
Yeah. You're not thinking as much about the audience, maybe.
It's kind of embarrassing to think back at all those things like that you assume, and then in retrospect you realize.
Yes.
But they say, don't they, that you can't be successful unless you climb cringe mountain. You have to put out bad stuff and cringe at it.
It's true.
If you go and look at some of the biggest creators on the planet, the stuff they started with is not necessarily their finest work.
And it's like a club we're all in together at some point, because it's inevitable. Like, it's gonna happen if you're creating anything. So just go ahead and join the club with everyone else.
Absolutely. It's an important part of the journey. What was the worst piece of podcasting advice you ever got?
Because I'm in the business space with podcasting, people think it's going to be this really quick tool for sales in their business. So I don't know that it's necessarily advice, but maybe a big misconception that I see about podcasting, that it's you're going to be on one podcast and there's all the right people are going to hear that one podcast and just come running to you and want to buy your services.
I don't think there are many things that are less true than that. It's a relationship platform, not a discovery tool. And it's about building brand, and it might take years at best.
And no one wants to hear that.
No one wants to hear that. You're right. Why did your podcast die?
I just couldn't sustain the publication schedule, which was already kind of erratic. I think I realized that I was not going to be building a community with this. This was not going to be an effective way to create the conversations I wanted to be having that I felt were important. I think that I had like a deeper knowing, even if I didn't consciously realize that's why. But it's like, this isn't going to have the intended result that I wanted. And I'm also already struggling very early in to keep it going. So what's this going to look like in even a couple of months from now if it's already this hard? So I think that's ultimately why it sort of faded away.
Dare I ask, what did you do to build this community, if anything?
I knew so little about community building. I don't think I even had the words to know that that's what I was after.
Okay. That's something you say now with hindsight.
Yes. And I'm glad you asked it that way. I have no community building skills. And, there's people that's their whole expertise is how to build community, how to resonate with people, keep those people around you. That was never going to be my journey. And I think I just didn't know that at the time. And that's fine.
And I think you've highlighted a great point that you also don't necessarily know what will come of it. Sounds like, to a certain extent, you started the podcast for two reasons. One was to share what was going on in your head about the idea of quitting and failure and that kind of thing, but also to have a creative outlet for something.
Yes. Especially, as a writer, I've been a writer as long as I can remember from childhood. And however that expresses itself, either, the early days of blogging, and even now as like a business writer, I help other people write. It's interesting how your creative expression can kind of change forms over time as we change as people, as circumstances change, but there's still always that need to like express in some way. And I think the Give It a Rest was part of that for me.
Was there an exact moment you knew it was over?
I don't think there was. It was so gradual. There was just me trying to continue to be consistent, which was the biggest struggle. A whole year went between the second to last episode and the very last episode.
Oh, wow.
So
you took a big rest.
Yes. And still thought, well, maybe I can still use it for some purpose. So I'll put an episode out. And then it was like, as I had published it, and I was like, I think that's probably when I knew, like, this is the last of it for me. Like the spark isn't there anymore. And maybe this has just kind of served its purpose and it can go on its way.
So the last episode doesn't wrap the thing up, or you don't say this is the last episode?
No.
One of the challenges of podcasting is that resting isn't really in line with how you build audiences and grow podcasts in the modern era.
Yes.
We live in this world of consumption and consistency and regularity. And whilst it is possible to make a great podcast that maybe only publishes a season every 6 months or whatever, like a Netflix show might, it has a compromise, which is, a whole different commitment to your marketing, for example, because unfortunately you lose listeners to other shows and it's so hard to pull them back because people don't listen to 25 different podcasts. They only listen to 6. So if you go out of their day-to-day habit, it's hard to get back into it. So it doesn't really lean into the option of being able to have a rest. What are some of the worst decisions you made when making the podcast?
Probably not considering audience first. That's the biggest part of creating, for like, who's going to consume this? Who is this going to help? How is it going? Like, what gaps or is this going to fill that people can't get somewhere else?
Did you ever think about that?
Not for Give It a Rest, no.
So does that mean in turn that you didn't do very much marketing either?
Correct. I think I had the easy out for myself of it, like, oh, well, it's not business related. I'm not trying to use it as a business tool to grow my business, so I don't have to market it. It's just for fun. It's something that I think is valuable, that, the people close to me seem to find valuable too. I had a few like really dedicated listeners actually that would ask, are you bringing it back? I really missed your podcast. That was nice. I appreciated the support, but it just wasn't like, that can't be the only thing, like you know what I mean? Like a handful of people, which I'm so grateful they did. But if the input of energy isn't matching up to like the external results that it's creating in the world, it's like, is this worth it? Does this matter to enough people? Does this still matter to me?
And not knowing your audience, which you say is one of the worst decisions that you did or didn't make, I guess, was the challenge here, makes it really hard because your podcast really needs to either be listened to more by the same people, so you want someone that's already a fan to listen to more of what you make, or you need to find new audiences. And if you don't know who you're making it for, you don't know where to find new audiences, it's nearly impossible to make it grow. What about good decisions and any that you made too late?
I probably wouldn't have chose podcasting as my format in general. I love podcasting. I think it's a wonderful platform with so much potential and so many benefits for the right people doing certain specific things. For me at that time, it just wasn't. If I was talking to myself now, especially in a business context, I'd be like, that's not what you need to do. What you need, you feel like you want to have, creative expression, and that's great. And podcasting is fun, and you can do it. Like you know how to set one up, you know how to come up with a name and do all the admin that goes with it, the show note writing and publishing and all that stuff. But because you can doesn't really mean you should.
It sounds to me, kind of poetically, that the best decision that you made too late was to give it a rest. Is that about right?
Yes, absolutely right.
What aspect of the podcast do you wish you'd focused more of your energy on?
Sustainability. I didn't have like a set publishing schedule that I can recall, or ways to come up with ideas that were like more generative. It's like I would have a flash in the pan idea and then do an episode on that. And then it's like, okay, well, what am I going to do for the next episode? Because the next episode has to happen now. What am I going to do? What am I going to do? There was no consistent, like, inspirational way for me to have like impactful content ideas. Really, it was very like fly by the seat of your pants and not thinking very much about value for people.
Did you mourn the passing of your podcast, or were you relieved to see it die?
Ooh, I don't think I did mourn it. I was grateful for the experience, and it was maybe a little bittersweet because I think I still maybe saw some potential there, but it also just felt like this has served its purpose, and I was okay with letting it go.
From everything you've learned, what piece of advice would you give to a podcaster about to make their first episode?
About to make their first episode. I think the biggest would even be what might even happen before they record is to be very, very, very sure that you want to start a podcast, that this is your platform. You've gone through all the the self-questioning of, is this right for me? Is this right for my business? Is this right for the clients that I want to nurture, that I want, really think about that, and don't let how fun and easy it looks kind of outweigh your true judgment of that. You want to be very sure and committed to that journey. And I guess that would come before you even press record, but just be sure that that's the avenue you want to travel down.
I think that's great advice. The number of people I meet who want to start a podcast but have never tried it, they've never done a pilot episode, they've never just interviewed their mate, they've never been a guest. And then they discover that this job of hosting a podcast isn't just having a conversation. There's a script and potential answers, and having to listen to your answer whilst thinking about what you're going to say next. And the fact it's not just a conversation over a beer, it's much more than that.
Yes. I've had someone message me on LinkedIn about my services. I help people who want to be podcast guests. And someone was like, I want to be on podcasts because I want to have conversations. And I was like, have you ever done it before? Nope. It's like, okay, well, let's start there. And your whole description of that, it's you're not just sitting with someone and pressing record and just whatever comes up, comes up. If the podcast that you're listening to sounds like that, it's because the interviewer is very good at their job.
I think that's so true and so misunderstood. The easier it looks, the more of a compliment that is to the person who made it.
Yes.
If your podcast had a headstone, what would you put on it?
She gave it a rest.
Perfect. I was wondering which of the many phrases around give it a rest you were going to go for. So this is kind of the time in the podcast where we talk about whether the podcast should be resurrected or whether it should stay in the podcast graveyard. And I think it's a fairly easy decision on this one. I feel like I'm really happy that you made the show because it's set you up to have a great next phase of your career and a job that you love and a new podcast that you're clearly really enjoying in a much more enjoyable format with a much healthier framework around you. So it feels like it was a really good vocational qualification. And even though Give It a Rest has been laid to rest, you now have a new podcast. And so maybe from quitting, that was what needed to happen in order for you to flourish and do something new.
1000% the case. Yes.
But I think we would be agreed in saying that it should stay firmly in the graveyard.
Yes.
Unless you really disagree, which I don't think you do, the heavenly afterlife is the best place for Give It a Rest, the podcast.
Yes. I think it can rest in peace.
It can. I've really enjoyed this memorial today, and I feel like you have really got in the spirit of reflecting on the show and being really open and honest with both yourself and me and the listeners about your experience. And for that, I can only say thank you.
Thank you.